In our last video, we created the sides of our box or small storage, we created the top, and I just got you to the point where we were going to do an assembly. Okay, so I'm going to now do that in full. So we're going to go File, New, make sure I'm on metric, and then here's my assemblies in the middle. So I go look for the options, and I'm going for a standard millimeter inventor assembly. So I create that. Give Inventor a moment to work out what it's doing. Okay, so I've got a side, a top, and an assembly. It's a third document. And what I do is I bring in those parts. So I'm going to be quite clever, quite careful about what I do here, because we've got to get a couple of things absolutely right so that it works out. I'm going to right click, and I'm going to place the component. And I have to find it. And this is why it's important to know where you've saved things. So I'm going to go to my small storage folder, and I'm going to bring in the top. It's actually the top and bottom. Okay, now if I look at that from the front view, it's giving me from the front view, it's giving me the front of the object. So I'm actually going to rotate my object, and I'm going to go right click and rotate in the X axis. If you look at this red line, that's the X axis. I'm going to rotate it 90 degrees. Okay, now when you look in virtual models, it's quite difficult to tell where you are, so you're going to have to just follow me on that one. I'm going to click to place it, and then I'm going to place another one. Just click. And then it'll keep placing them unless I press right click and cancel. Alright. So what I did there is I placed my first object, then I placed my second object. Now, depending on where you look, they're in the right place or the wrong place. So I'm going to just change my view so you can see what I mean. It's very difficult to tell where they really are. So that's where I use my view cube up on the top right here to tell me where the front is and where the right hand side is. So if I now click on front to see that view, you can see I've got my two ends. So if I turn it left using those little arrows, it orientates so I can see where my part is. Okay, so from the right hand side, what I'm looking at is those two components. From the front, I'm looking at the edge of it. Right. Now you'll notice that those two are not lined up with each other. I'm not too worried about that at the moment, but what I am going to do is I'm going to take this object, everything's free moving from it, I'm going to take that part and I'm going to actually lock it into place, because then everything gets locked into place with it. So if you watch this for a second, I'm going to click on that, I'm going to right click, and I'm going to make it grounded. Okay. So that object now, if I click and drag, can't move it. And you see it's got like a little drawing pin next to it to show it can't move. This one can move wherever I want it still. Okay, but I'm going to just leave it for a minute. I'm going to let that one hang loose for a minute whilst I get on with this one. So I'm going to bring in now a left-hand side and a right-hand side. So watch this. Right click, place components. This time we're bringing in the sides. Open. I'm going to position my first one there, and my next one, this is where I want you to be a little bit clever. You might not understand why I'm doing this at first, but we're going to bring in one to the left, one to the right, but I'm going to flip this one round so it's facing inwards, and I'm going to rotate. If you look where the Y arrow is pointing, I'm going to rotate around the Y axis 180 degrees. Right click Y once, right click Y twice. And then I'm going to place it. And at this point, it'll keep placing more until I go right click and cancel. So I've got one here, one at the other end of it, ish. That face is now facing into that face. Right, so let's just have a look at it from a different view, and you'll see how it's all over the place. So hopefully you might remember from when we did the dumper truck activity, you then have to make things click into position. You have to assemble them, right? So I remember this one's locked. So my first job is going to be to lock this joint against this joint, right? But to make things easier for myself and to line up a couple of other parts, I'm going to line these faces up first. And then I'm going to line those faces up first. So watch this. Right click, constraint. Lots of options, don't worry about those. I'm going to click on that face. I'm going to click on that face. It'll make a funny noise. And it's done the opposite of what I wanted it to do. It's done what we call a mate. Okay, as opposed to a flush. So I'm going to change that to flush. And it flips it over, so those two are now totally in alignment. Okay, they're not lined up left and right, but they're lined up face to face there. Right, so I'm going to place that in position. And do the same thing with that face and that face. Here we go. Right click, constraint. Choose that face carefully and that face carefully. Okay, so again we've got them mated. We're going to turn that to flush. And okay that. So those two are now flush in that orientation. Alright, so I'm going to roughly place them in position so I can see where they're going. And now we're going to start locking some other bits together. We're going to put that joint together. So I'm going to lock this face here in line with that face there. Right, so let's just get a bit closer with my middle mouse wheel. That face there locked onto that face there. Right click, constraints. Look at where I'm choosing. Click and click. And we make sure again that it's a flush. See how those two have lined up now? Okay. So I can move it up and down, but it's always lined up with that face. Alright, now my simplest option for the next bit is to make that face and that face line up. Right, because at the moment they're not lined up. I think what I might do is just, no I won't. I was going to change the colour, but I think we'll leave it as it is. I might just change the view so you can see my edges a bit better. Okay, there you can see the edges. So now I'm going to line up this face here with that face there. Right click, constraints, click, click. Now again it's gone to mates. I want to make it flush. So I click on that option there. And OK that. So that now is locked into position. That face there and that face there are lined up. This face here and this face here are lined up. So the only way that can move now, it can't move anywhere else apart from up and down. Okay, so we'll let that just sit there for a minute whilst we go and do the other one. Now the other one, it's already going to be lined up in a couple of places, because if you remember, that one, that side and that side, I'd locked together. I'd flushed them up. So all I have to do now is I have to lock that face to that face, and it will line up the same. So let's do that. I'm going to just zoom in a little bit so you can see what I'm doing. Right click, constraints, this face and that face. I nearly chose the wrong faces. That face and that face. Okay, so again it's giving me a mates and I want to flush. Hopefully you saw that move in. Flush. So we OK that. So that now can only move up and down. Same as this one. So I've got a couple of choices now. When I come to locking this all together, I can either lock individually that one to that one and that one to that one. But what I'd prefer to do is to lock this one to this one. I'm saying lock, I should really be saying constrain. So here we go, I'm going to right click and constrain, and I'm going to choose to take that top surface there and make sure it's lined up with that top surface there. This time, because it's annoying me, I'm going to put it on flush before I start. Okay, so here we go. Click on that. Click on that. And OK. Now what you might not have noticed, this little bit jumped up then to line up with this one. So now if I move either of those two, they move together up and down that way. I can't move them left or right because they're locked together. And they're locked to that part. And remember, this one was stuck down. So there's only one place to go, and that's up and down. All right, so I've got a simple solution to that. Hopefully you can work it out now. I can constrain that face to that face, or I can constrain this inside face to that face. It will do exactly the same thing. And when I do that, it will bring that one down at the same point. Let's do that face there. Sorry, let's do the bottom face there to that face there. Watch this. Right click, constraint. And this time it's going to be a mate because we want the two surfaces to meet. So it's a mate, not a flush. So I'm going to choose that face there. I'm going to turn it over. I'm going to choose that face there. Click, and it pulls it into place. So now I can't move it up, I can't move it left and right, and I can't move it backwards and forwards. It's totally constrained. The only component here that's got any freedom of movement is this top part. Okay. Now that one, it can move up and down, it can move left and right, but what it can't do, because that face and that face have been flushed, it can't move that way. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to now choose to constrain that end there to that end there, and I'm going to do that using my flush tool because I want the two to be flush. So that's just jumped across a little bit. So it can move up and down, but it can't move left and right. So these are all constrained. We constrain its movement. Final one is going to be the underside of that to the inside of that joint. Let's do that by changing my view. I'm going to right click constraints. I'm going to choose that one, click. I'm going to choose that one. We're going to make sure they're a mate. Interesting looking at this, and this would be where as a design engineer you'd be looking quite carefully. Somehow I haven't quite lined that up properly, which makes me think that my original joint isn't quite right. One of them looks like it's probably been 20 and the other one's 19 because I've got an overlap there. Right, now for the purposes of this video I'm not going to go back and fix that, but when you're doing your own projects you probably want to go and sort out where that gap's coming from. But for now, that gives us a reasonable assembly. I'm going to use my view cube just to give me a nice orientation on that. So I clicked on that corner then. Job done. File, save as, make sure you know where you're saving it, and you're going to call that storage assembly 1 and save. In the next video we'll look at creating a drawing, a technical drawing from this part, this assembly.